Europe has entered a new geopolitical era. Enlargement, security, and resilience are no longer separate debates, they are the same conversation. Welcome to Invigorate EU Talks, a podcast series born from a major EU-funded Horizon research project, bringing together leading scholars and policymakers from across Europe to do exactly what the name suggests: reinvigorate EU enlargement and neighborhood policy in a changing world. I am Mariam Khotanashvili, Executive Director of TEPSA, the Trans-European Policy Studies Association. In this third episode, we ask, has the EU become better at promoting democracy, or has geopolitics changed the rules of the game? We are joined today by His Excellency, the Ambassador of Montenegro to the European Union, Petar Markovic. And I would also like to warmly welcome Professor Richard Youngs and Professor Giselle Bossen. Richard is a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, professor at the University of Warwick, and co-founder and director of the European Democracy Hub. Giselle is a full professor at Maastricht University, visiting professor at the College of Europe, and a fellow at the European Democracy Hub. Both Giselle and Richard are important contributors to the Invigorate EU project and authors of Invigorate EU papers on democracy support innovations in the Western Balkans and in the Eastern neighborhood. I'll start with Richard. Richard, for decades, democracy support has been a cornerstone of EU enlargement and neighborhood policy. But the world looks very different today than it did even 5 years ago. If you had to identify one genuinely innovative element of the EU's current democracy support toolbox, what would it be? And have we really learned new lessons, or are we mostly repackaging old approaches?
I think the EU has learned some lessons. I think to answer the title of the podcast, I think the EU's got better at democracy support, but non-democratic regimes have also got better at neutralizing those democracy policies. So the challenges have got greater as well. I would say the one innovative element is that the EU now has mechanisms to get support to smaller pro-democracy organizations in different countries at a grassroots level, is better at targeting its support to individual democratic agents of change. That you switched away from doing such big institutional reform programs and is better at protecting the kind of democratic activists, democratic organizations that have been attacked so mercilessly by regimes over the last years. But to answer your question, Mariam, I think there's still a lot more room for innovation. Democracy support has improved, but it hasn't changed enough. And I think the interesting thing for this podcast is that the way democracy support is done under the enlargement process is quite different. It's quite sui generis from the EU's broader approach to democracy, in some good ways and some bad ways. The EU still has the funding for democracy in enlargement countries. It doesn't have that money in other regions. It still has leverage because candidate countries want to join the EU. In other places, countries are now happier just to reject the EU's incentives. So the EU's kind of still in the game in democracy support in the enlargement countries, but the accession methodology continues to be so heavy, so top down. This is an observation that's been made for many, many years, and in a way that's crowding out some of the newer, more nimble approaches to democracy support that the EU has foregrounded in other countries around the world.
Accession methodology top down. We will continue discussing this today. But before that, Giselle, one theme that's running through your work is that democracy support today is increasingly intertwined with geopolitical competition. Has the EU become more geopolitical in the way it promotes democracy? And if so, does that make democracy support stronger or weaker in your view?
Yeah, I've also mainly looked at this in the context of EU enlargement, and I think that's also where I would answer the question, maybe mainly from this angle. So yes, clearly, yeah, the EU has become more geopolitical in its democracy support. Democracy is no longer, treated as, say, a long-term reform agenda, but it's increasingly linked to security, resilience, foreign interference, disinformation, right, and also geopolitical alignment. And we see that, most concretely in its relations to candidate countries. But the geopolitical turn makes EU democracy support both stronger but also weaker. right? So stronger in the sense that it moves through the more securitizing discourse, democracy also much closer to EU foreign policy or security policy. And so it's not longer just reform agenda, but it's part of Europe's security architecture. If you look at it through the optimistic angle, and Moldova is a good example here. Other countries as well. We now have democratic resilience is now understood also as geopolitical, as security priority. The EU has mobilized major growth plans, with significant funding attached. That gives more sustained political attention. Secondly, also, the toolbox somewhat becomes, harder or more operational. Mostly with traditional democracy support, we're looking at elections, civil society funding, rule of law assistance, civic education, you name it. They remain essential. But we now also see much more focus linked democracy support and crisis management, cybersecurity, countering foreign information manipulation. So this is now all linked. But so you could say, again, looking at it optimistically, that democracy support now has more teeth. So it can help also build infrastructure needed to survive hybrid warfare or counter hybrid warfare, for example. And I think in a way, geopolitics gives democracy stronger anchor. Of course, democratic ideals are great, but they are not enough when country faces coercion, war, energy dependence, disinformation, and other types of, authoritarian pressures and external pressures. So by connecting integration, economic resilience, security cooperation, democracy, we're making also democratic choices, trying to make them possible again, or keep or protect democratic choices. But of course, and Richard already mentioned some of the drawbacks earlier, geopolitics or the geopolitical turn makes democracy support also weaker. There's a risk of selectivity. We are defending democracy strongly, for example, where it helps to counter Russia, and importantly so, but we're much more softer when it's about energy cooperation, migration control, strategic partnerships, right? And then credibility suffers. Also, democracy support, in my opinion, also has become a bit more personalized around pro-EU governments and elites, and maybe not so much anchored in democratic institutions and citizens. So here, I think it's important to remember, well, we can still also criticize governments for democratic performance, even when they're broadly pro-European. So I think it's also that also is important. And the third risks, of course, is in the policies, in the programs themselves, like the growth plans. There's formally focus on the fundamentals, but very often the milestones are more linked to security or market-related integration, as civil society is not properly involved. So there is also, quite some research on this as well.
We will unpack this further, and I have a very tricky question for you later on how to counter the foreign manipulation. But Ambassador Markovic, Montenegro has become the frontrunner of the enlargement process in the Western Balkans. We often hear the motto 28 by 28. Commissioner Kos has expressed the ambition to close all negotiating clusters with Montenegro by the end of 2026, so by the end of the Irish presidency. So, from Montenegro's perspective, do EU democracy support innovations feel real? Whether we're talking about the revised enlargement methodology, the growth plan, or any other new forms of engagement with candidate countries, does the process feel more political to you, more credible, more assuring or reassuring, or perhaps simply more technical?
Well, that's not a simple question, but let me try to briefly answer. Yes, we see definitely that the process has become more political. We welcome this because it was a ticket for Montenegro, who has always been the front runner in the process since the last enlargement of Croatia, and not just in the Western Balkans, but in the entire cohort of candidate countries, and now is reinforced as such. It has been our ticket, this geopolitical turn precipitated by the Russian aggression in Ukraine, to come to the much earned and never enough given spotlight and actually show to the entire EU and wider that the country the size of Montenegro, with performances like Montenegro, with consolidated and still consolidating democratic institutions and a very good consensual political culture like Montenegro, without majority nation like your usual candidate country, but already for centuries built on the need to build consensus, which is now turning out to be a key ingredient of our success. We are the lowest hanging fruit, the biggest and the easiest opportunity for you to finally vindicate the enlargement policy as a democracy consolidating policy toolkit, which is founded on rule of law, on merits, and not driven primarily and only by geopolitical concerns. So, I mean, it's a mixed bag of answers. To borrow from Giselle's work, the challenge here isn't to separate values and security, but to see how they reinforce each other. And I think that in Montenegro, as a credible merit-based accession process poster case study, both democratic and geopolitical priorities come together. Now, the growth plan, just to briefly cover it, I think this has been the biggest technocratic revolution as of late. This process-based, results-oriented exchange for concrete reform that you can show that you delivered and a concrete amount of money has been incredibly incentivizing, first in the reform and recovery framework of post-pandemic EU member states, and then copy-pasted to growth plan logic in the Western Balkans, followed by the similar mechanisms in Moldova and Ukraine. The biggest issue I take with the growth plan is that it's not big enough. It doesn't grow enough. We need much more EU funds, which otherwise go to candidate countries, to be funneled in this very concrete conditioning way, because EU conditionality has been toothless, I agree, without the proper amount of sticks and carrots. And the carrots are best served in the doses of this growth plan logic. We now need to step up this, and this is an ideal time to actually be discussing this, because the global Europe envelope in the next multi-annual financial framework is being decided on, and whether or not Montenegro will benefit from this directly, because, as you said, our plan is to be the next EU member by the end of 2028, to reverse the Brexit effect finally after 2016, to show that the EU can grow, that it has a magnetic power to attract new members, but also the know-how and the right tools. Once they are attracted, they don't slam against the EU door, but they actually are able to enter to that door. We need this to be much more ambitious as an envelope, and it has to approach at least a bit more the amount that member states get from cohesion policy and structural funds, because what we see now is that the investment need for Montenegro, even a small country, which is best off among any other candidate, is so big that the growth plan does not begin to cover the gap. This is not a problem for Montenegro, because we have always had our strategic aim towards EU membership, no matter the cost. So we are not transactional about this. We are very deontological. But you see countries in our immediate neighborhood which are still on the fence, trying to leverage EU funding and reputational positive effect with Chinese investment, Russian influence, trying to get as much money from different geopolitical actors. The only way for the EU to show that it can grow and to insulate itself from competition is through a more robust enlargement policy. But Montenegro will be the good case how to take this process forward.
Richard, you argue in your paper that financial support through IPA, which is the instrument for pre-accession assistance, and the growth plan needs to be linked to measurable progress, but without turning accession into this box-ticking exercise, right? So my first question would be, how do you strike that balance? And now also following up on what the ambassador has said, I think you make a similar argument in your paper that the growth plan is actually too small. It doesn't really match the ambition. So how does the EU support compare with the influence that other actors, including China, can bring through investment and economic engagement?
For me to say, the crucial point for this discussion is that the amounts the EU gives directly for democracy are actually very, very small compared to the growth plan, what it puts into energy, climate transition, cyber security, and the like. Although democratic values are supposed to be the driving wedge of enlargement, in fact, the amounts of money dedicated to that issue are fairly small. And in fact, what the EU can offer that China and others cannot is more the qualitative side of economic modernization, the strength of societies and values and institutional change. That's where the EU does have a strategic advantage over other actors. And I think that behoves the EU to push the balance, tilt the balance a little bit more towards the more socially oriented, political reform oriented parts of the agenda. It's not, what concerns me a bit is that it's not true that simply pumping lots of funding into preparing countries for accession delivers good quality democracy. That is not the case. And that tends to be the kind of assumption that underpins a lot of EU policy. In fact, many elements of the accession process can almost unwittingly hollow out democratic accountability. Of course, if enlargement is done well, it can act as the primary driver, as in Montenegro, of a democratic reform process. But it can inadvertently make democratization shaky. It can make it more difficult. And I think that Mariam, is why the methodology needs to change and the milestones need to focus not just on particular legislative changes, but indicators of democratic participation. All these indicators exist, they're not new, but they don't really drive enlargement in the same way as the more formal institutional milestones do. And I think that's an imbalance that militates against good quality democratization.
Giselle, in recent weeks, we've had several discussions on enlargement here in Brussels, and one recurring tension keeps coming up. Candidate countries are facing growing disinformation and foreign interference, yet some of the measures that are needed to counter these threats can sit uneasily with democratic principles. Russia, in particular, has become very skilled at exploiting this dilemma. Efforts to tackle propaganda or foreign influence are often portrayed as evidence that a country is becoming less democratic. So, how do you ensure democratic reforms while making sure they don't produce the opposite effect? And how do you strengthen democratic resilience without undermining the democratic principles we are trying to protect?
This is a very, very important question, Mariam. And, if anybody had a good answer to this, then I think we would be much more effective in responding to hybrid threats. But let me just say a few things about this. The threats that candidate countries face are very real. The disinformation, foreign interference, what you just named. Democracies need security, military, legal protection. So you're going to create some dilemmas. But I think the question is, how to mediate those. The restrictions on media, the overly broad foreign influence laws, emergency powers, these kind of things. And of course, as you mentioned, Russia exploits this, and not only this particular one, but of course behind this is the broader strategy of trying to breed more cynicism, distrust, fear, confusion, the idea that all politicians are corrupt, media are manipulated, truth itself cannot be trusted. So this is super dangerous. So we have to try to somewhat engage with this as well. And I would say there are a couple of rather concrete things that one can do, or maybe to have some safeguards to potentially keep a bit of a democratic check when, for example, anti-disinformation or foreign interference laws are being drafted. Usually that happens behind closed doors, interior ministries or security services. And if such laws are somewhat supported through EU programs, then one should have more structured co-drafting with independent journalists, digital rights organizations, human rights groups, civil society watchdogs. And the EU is not always paying as much attention to as it should, right? Civic actors can identify provisions that threaten civic space. And this is partly happening, of course, that they are being asked and involved, but it's not consistently. Also, when it comes to emergency security measures, just as much in candidate countries as within the EU itself, and they need judicial safeguards. So if a government wants to take actions, close down a media outlet, etc., at least it should not be left to executive discretion. And I think this is also in the interest of everyone. There should be some kind of, be it fast but independent judicial review. But then, and this is the most important point I really want to bring across. Resilience is not only about state resilience. Of course, as I said before, we have to respond to hybrid warfare with military capabilities, with internal security, sanctions, legal instruments, protection of critical infrastructure. The other major part, and I feel, this is under-addressed also in the EU's policies, and that is ultimately, in my opinion, the most democratic answer to foreign interference, right? And that is societal resilience. And we need, I think, much more substantive funding for direct support to independent media, local fact-checking, public interest litigation groups, civic education, whistleblower protection, investigative journalists. You have it. The EU does already some of this, but supporting these democratic ecologies is so important here as well, because I think that is also where the resilience against misinformation, etc., very, very much comes from. And I guess that would be my main point here: the democratic, the societal resilience, which we really mustn't neglect.
Ambassador Markovic, does Montenegro also face this dilemma? And how do you balance the need to protect democratic institutions from foreign interference while preserving an open democratic space? And of course, you're also invited to reflect on what Giselle has just suggested as possible solutions.
We had this dilemma in previous periods when the staggering level of political polarization across the region, but also in Montenegro, was actually inhibiting us from making better headways in reforming key rule of law reforms, for which in the parliament you needed qualified majorities. Now, looking at this previous phase, which is mercifully behind us, we can actually see that a lot of it was caused by foreign malign interference of Russia, its proxies in the region on the one hand, and links and nexuses of organized crime and corruption with domestic political and media outlets. They were artificially creating an extreme polarized situation which was disabling democratic decisions to be enacted in the interest of citizens. Finally, the collective intelligence of democratic people is always higher than those who derail it. So Montenegrins, through a couple of elections, managed to make their society more resilient and elected a government which is now finishing the generational task of EU membership. And we are learning by doing, and are finally managing to get the safeguards Giselle was speaking about. We are not here, however, speaking about the safeguards in the prospective accession treaty, starting with the one of Montenegro that member states are speaking about, but we're speaking about precisely the infrastructure, both the hardware and the software of saving the integrity of the finals of the accession process and of the electoral system in Montenegro, which the next elections are going to be held in June next year. So right after we plan to finish and hopefully the accession negotiations and hopefully sign the accession treaty. In addition to this, it took us a bit of time. It took us some time to convince the EU institutions that they made the mistake by only signing a security and defense partnership with our neighbors, North Macedonia and Albania. We drew attention to them to the fact that by omitting or forgetting to sign it with Montenegro just because it's an unproblematic Western Balkan country, they're maybe unintentionally falsely sending the message that there is something about the only remaining NATO member in the region that they don't trust. So we initiated the security and defense dialogue, the lion's share of which actually focuses on how to counter and prevent foreign line interference. And this is only going to increase in the case of Montenegro as the front runner, either directly from Russia. We see this in our security operational data every day. There was an attempt from the region, a very clear one, much advertised in the media, to cloud or shadow the triumph of the EU Western Balkan summit held in beautiful Tivat in Montenegro in the end of May, which was prevented by a fantastic coordination of our domestic police and secret services. We are having a structural dialogue with EU and a selected number of member states in getting the know-how, the infrastructure to counter any threats, be it on our critical infrastructure and cybersecurity. Because I remind you, in summer of 2022, we had a complete overhaul attack of our entire government critical infrastructure. Our emails were not working for 6 months. So now we are working on that. Media is a big problem. It hasn't been mentioned enough. Montenegro is the country in Europe which fares far better than any in the Western Balkans, and even better than 10 member states when it comes to media rights and freedom of expression. But over 80% of media outlets in Montenegro have ownership which come from outside, mostly Serbia. And this is a problem. There are some media outlets across Europe which bear Europe in its name and have a capital which is much more murky and dubious. We need to be very conscious of this and tread carefully, because at this point, when you're this late and this advanced, all someone needs to do is to get you to slip and fall in a critical time and show that no, enlargement is not credible. You see, it was never meant to happen. This deadline was never realistic, or the EU never meant it seriously. So those who want to defeat the credibility of Europe as a democratic actor and promoter, they don't have to burn down the entire palace. It's enough to take out one wood from the stage. So we need to be very mindful and awake, and not let technical problems get in the way of clear political success.
Richard, when you look at countries that have been most exposed to external pressure, whether from Russia, China, or actually domestic illiberal actors, what actually makes a democracy resilient in your view? Giselle talked about the societal resilience funding. Which investments pay off in the long term, and where does the EU still get it wrong?
It depends on the country, Miriam, depends on the kind of political context. I think democratic resilience is a useful concept, but we need to be a little bit careful because we don't use it in a way that's very imprecise and vague. I think the crucial thing in this context is that specifically across the candidate countries, the different countries face very different challenges related to democracy. They need different kinds of resilience. There are some countries that are undergoing really pronounced autocratization, where resilience basically is about protecting societies from the worst forms of repression, of almost overtly authoritarian regimes. At the other end of the spectrum, you have countries that have governments reasonably strongly committed to democratic reform, where it's more a question of helping them to build up formal state capacity in order to implement reform. So I think we just need to look at different countries and understand the ingredients of good democratic resilience are very different. As a very, very generic guideline, I think Giselle already answered the question. Good resilience comes not just when you have good societal and good institutional resilience, but when those two elements fuse together and mutually reinforce each other. That's difficult to do in practice. It means, as others have said, it's not just about pumping money into governments to beef up cyber resilience. It's also a matter of supporting the kind of local democratic agents of change. And the trouble is that when these agents of change mobilize in the name of democracy, rather than receiving European support, they actually receive a lot of opposition, or at least ambivalence, from the EU. And that doesn't strike me as a good template for democratic resilience.
Giselle, one of the challenges in the Eastern neighborhood is that countries are often expected to pursue democratization while simultaneously dealing with war, occupation, territorial disputes, or acute security threats. Has the EU fully adapted its democracy support to these realities? Or is it still asking countries to follow a model of democratic transformation that was designed for much more stable circumstances?
Again, very important question, and maybe I would maybe look at it in a slightly more differentiated way. But I would say that the EU has adapted, but partially and also unevenly, man, depending on which country you look at. But especially in the enlargement context, in Ukraine, the EU's involvement puts democratic reform also in a completely different policy context. It responded, by bringing accession, also making that part of, or bringing it together with defense support, with reconstruction, and then, linking that then also to democratic reform progress. I mean, it's not that this all, works very nicely in tandem in some way or another. I think it probably can't, given the context of the war. But, I think the EU has also understood that when on the one hand, you give military support to Ukraine. You can ask, whether this is or was sufficient. But at the same time, also, when it comes to foreign interference, malfunctioning courts, and corruption, that are, of course, also very futile grounds, and also make the country, vulnerable to the Russian influence in a different way. So I think that is recognized by the EU, and you can see that in the different policies and approaches. But also Moldova is another example where this happens. Very clearly now the EU has recognized that we cannot separate the democratic trajectory from the existence and countering hybrid threats, disinformation, cyber vulnerabilities, energy pressure, even, etc., attempts to destabilize the elections. So here too, I think the EU has done quite a lot of work in order to make sure that these different initiatives always tie together. And then in the context of Armenia, I mean, that's not a candidate country, but you mentioned it earlier also in one of your questions. We are looking at the EU offering more socioeconomic resilience, connectivity, diversification strategies, so to somehow enable the country also to make sovereign and democratic choices. But yeah, so the EU has adapted. I think there's no question about it. But there are two major points, that where I would say that it has not, and I think they are very critical. And this is not just about the war context, the first point I want to make, but it's really about the consistent and credible application of democratic conditionality. Now, and I don't have to explain to you, where the EU is not consistent in this context. But as long as we have governments within the EU to backslide, as long as we have member state vetoes that have nothing to do with democratic progress, but with bilateral disputes or kind of domestic issues, this is not consistent. And the problem is, this is a problem under normal circumstances. In countries exposed to Russian pressure, right, this is even more serious, because you have societies that are asked to take real geopolitical and domestic risks. And it's not only expensive, but there are sometimes even existential risks here. And then if you have progress when it comes to accession negotiations blocked for reasons that have nothing to do with reforms, that has much more serious implications. So that's one thing. And the second part here is, of course, geopolitics is not an end in itself. That is clear. I think it should be a tool, and to achieve defending, protecting democracy in Europe. But still, the geopolitics as a tool somehow also has to function. And that's, of course, when we also start to talk about security guarantees, because democratic reforms function very, very well. But as you said, the context is a completely different one, and the countries have to make existential decisions, and Russia makes them into existential decisions. And I think sometimes several EU member states, and certainly also publics, they're not aware, I think, of this very serious context. And it's in that sense, I guess the EU has to be much more serious also about the protection that it's willing to offer. But at the same time, of course, there is the question of what the EU or Europe or NATO and under the current context of the US that is not a reliable, ally anymore. But what it actually can offer in terms of security guarantees. And I'm not very optimistic here in that sense that the EU can do its bit, get its act together in security and defense. But even then, I think in the current international disorder, there's not geopolitical shifts. There's not one actor or power on its own who is in control of this. And the EU is not even amongst the strongest powers, which we all know. So I think here there is a level of I think structural international relations related uncertainties that are very hard to manage. But I think the EU has us to think about its willingness also to give these security guarantees, at least agree on some to start with, and then maybe also be realistic about it. And I think that realism is something that, of course, also Ukraine is grappling with at this moment in time.
Very shortly, in 2 or 3 sentences each, please, if you could change one thing about the way you support democracy in candidate countries, what would it be? What is that one change that would make the biggest difference?
I would design a kind of common pooled fund for democratic reform that delivered projects on the ground that combine these different elements of reform, the digital elements, the social participative elements, the institutional reform elements. I would try and incentivize these reforms with a form of conditionality that was much more graduated and less heavy-handed, not less firm, but just implemented in a much more subtle and sophisticated way. And I would build bridges with the kind of newer agents of change that we're seeing emerging today, and encourage the EU to see these as possible agents of resilience, not enemies of democratic resilience.
I think what is extremely important is that the EU is consistent when it comes to its when it comes to the merit-based approach, when it comes to reacting to reforms, but also reacting to violations of democratic standards. And we cannot, as I said before, we cannot have an enlargement process that is that it is unpredictable. For candidate countries, where we have delays that have nothing to do with democratic reforms, because, as I said before, the stakes, are now so much higher than they were in past enlargement rounds, and I think we have to realize this.
Ambassador Markovic, what would be your recommendation? What is that one change? Would it be more security assistance, more funding, faster rewards, stronger political engagement, perhaps less bureaucracy? From Montenegro's perspective, what would that be?
I think the next window of opportunity for the EU to really make enlargement a transformative tool it always wanted to be is the accession treaty with Montenegro, but not in the way that you think or suppose. It's clear that member states don't have the appetite to change the founding treaties in a way that this should be done as also a democratic constitutional decision of who we are as Europeans. And they want to do it through a small door of accession treaty drafting. Montenegro is fine to be the guinea pig for that, but how we go about it is a different story. And here the term which has been mentioned before, differentiation, is key. Truly geopolitical transforming and merit-based revision of the enlargement methodology would mean to differentiate between Montenegro, maybe Iceland together with us if they have a positive referendum at the end of summer, and the other countries that would join the EU after us. Because these two countries are advanced enough, democratically consolidated enough, rule of law secured enough to not pose any of the dangers or fears that member states have around larger, more complex enlargement to follow. So differentiated enlargement in accession treaty, where we would not have a priori taken veto and voting rights, prolong the transition periods, and be the guinea pig for all the complex enlargements to come. But we would get what we are due, and that is basically two countries with zero net effect on the budgets of citizens member states, zero net effect on labor policy, trade, etc. You only get the positives, you eschew all the negatives. So let's differentiate between future candidates and let us not waste time to show that the EU is a geopolitical giant that can, in the only country in the current political global context, that can peacefully grow its territory in a consensual way without waging war, trade wars, or the actual violent wars.
Thank you, Ambassador Peter Markovic. Thank you, Professor Richard Youngs. And thank you, Professor Giselle Bosse. And thank you all for listening. This was Invigorate EU Talks. This episode is brought to you by TUPSA, and it's part of the Invigorate EU project funded by the European Union.